The Japanese heavy cruiser Aoba is an interesting ship. Was she unlucky, or was the ship actually lucky? That is a tricky question to answer, because Aoba repeatedly suffered heavy, nearly crippling damage, from surface fire at Guadalcanal to bombing raids and on to submarine torpedoes. Each and every time, the ship took damage that might have sunk other ships. So you could say she was unlucky. But despite all the damage, the cruiser always managed to survive. She would be repaired and put back in action, even if the damage lingered. Because of this, Aoba managed to survive right up to the end of the Pacific War. So was she lucky? It's an interesting question. Regardless of where you fall on that subject, however, her luck did run out in the Kure bombing raids that sank so many Japanese ships. In today's video, we'll be looking at the end of Aoba's story, and at the wreck left behind in the aftermath of American bombing raids, as a continuation of this little mini-series looking at the Kure wrecks. First, let's look at how Aoba ended up in this situation. The first thing to note is that this cruiser isn't like the Issei's or Haruna. Those ships were undamaged and moored in Kure because of a lack of fuel. Aoba, on the other hand, was stuck in Japan because of her battle damage. In her case, the final straw came on October 23, 1944. A submarine, USS Bream, fired a spread of torpedoes at the cruiser. One of these hit the ship in her number 2 engine room. This caused a 13-degree list to starboard and severe flooding. It didn't sink the cruiser, but the damage was enough to finally put her out of service. After emergency repair work, Aoba arrived back in Japan. This was on December 12, 1944, where closer examination of the cruiser declared her unfit for further repair. The ship was, apparently, considered irreparable. Japanese resources by this point were strained to the breaking point, and one old heavy cruiser just wasn't worth the effort, especially with lingering issues from the other battle damage. As such, Aoba was moored in Kure and left in place, where she would remain as American bombing began in mid-1945. The first raids in March didn't cause any damage to the cruiser. However, a follow-up attack on April 24th would change that. Not a raid you see much talk about, because it was the March and July raids that would hit the capital ships. In any event, Aoba was hit by several bombs. This, coupled with near misses, caused the cruiser to settle on the harbor bottom. Technically speaking, the warship was sunk. However, the Japanese would raise the battered cruiser one final time. Aoba was brought back up, fitted with more 25mm guns, and moved to a new mooring, right alongside the shore where she could function as a stationary anti-aircraft battery, somewhat like what happened with the Issei's in a way. It would not save her. On July 24, 1945, the next major raid came to Kure. This time around 30 aircraft attacked Aoba. One direct hit and another near miss later, the cruiser was flooding again. By 10 p.m., the ship was on the bottom with a starboard list. The tough cruiser would not be salvaged again. Aoba was left in place, where she would be bombed again on July 28th in the final major raid on Kure. Despite already being sunk, more aircraft attacked the wreck. This led to 4 bomb hits that set Aoba's wreck on fire. That fire drew the attention of B-24 bombers, attacking the harbor at the same time. 4 more bombs hit Aoba as one of the few successes by B-24s at Kure. These blew part of the stern off and split the hull. The cruiser was well and truly sunk, and no amount of repair could change that. Not that the Japanese bothered. Aoba's wreck would be left in place, where she was eventually refloated in late 1946, before being towed off for scrapping. Unfortunately, I haven't found any pictures of that process. And as a final note, It isn't clear how many of Aoba's crew were lost during the raids. Combined fleet doesn't have a number, and neither does any other source I can find. Regardless, we've reached the end of this section. So with that in mind, let's now look at the wreck. An interesting wreck because Aoba is a classic case of the angle can obscure damage on a shipwreck. Take this one from the port side. She doesn't look that badly damaged from this angle. The ship is in shallow water and listing to starboard, but there's no immediately apparent damage, aside from the collapsed aircraft crane, and a very little hint of something all the way on the front of the bow. We'll return to that later. First, the rest of this picture. The bridge and funnels are both in place without any collapses. The same goes for the torpedo tubes, the various gun tubs, and the catapult on her stern. Even portholes and the bulge added for stability are still intact. The same story holds true when you look at the bridge structure. There's still no apparent damage from this close-in angle. The rangefinder, mast, and radar are all still in place, as is a boat davit here. The funnel also looks fine, as does the bridge itself, both the main bridge and the upper level. In any case, the moment you move further out, the true story becomes apparent. The close-in shots of the port side do a good job of obscuring the damage. When you move out, however, the pictures show the truth, most readily apparent on the stern here. Past the third turret, it vanishes. This is the area blown apart by the B-24s, with nothing left past that point. Whatever remains of the stern is completely underwater, assuming there's anything major left at all. You can also see how low in the water the wreck is towards the stern. The third turret is barely above the surface. The deck is almost completely flooded, with only a little bit visible. It's also more apparent how bad the list is in this image, just looking at the angle of the hull and the turrets. The ship probably would have capsized had the water been any deeper, even with the number 2 and number 3 turret both trained to port. That said, once you reach the funnels, the ship still doesn't look terrible. The stern is wrecked, but the port side of the ship still looks mostly fine, if very, very close to shore. We'll get a better look at just how close toward the end of the video. However, before that, there's one more picture of the port side that I want to share. This one looking from the bow. A picture that shows just how much the other angles obscured the damage. Remember that little hint in the first wreck image? You can see that here. There's a massive hole in the side just above the waterline. That's the first bit of clear damage we've had outside of the stern, and it's very notable. If the starboard side wasn't keeping it above water, this would have caused severe flooding. It probably still did because the hole extends that far down. When you look at it in color here, that's easier to see. Some of the hole seems to be below water. If the tide were any higher, it would be outright submerged. Aside from that, however, there's not much more to note, other than another look at how low in the water Aoba is towards her ruined stern. Not only is the ship listing, she's also settled unevenly on the bottom. This picture also rounds things off on the port side, with one exception. This image, which looks like a still from a video. It's a direct look at the bow, which mostly serves to give us a better glimpse of the hull. The metal is clearly blown outward, which means this is likely an internal explosion, not a result of a near miss. Unfortunately, the quality of the image doesn't allow for more insights, other than the color of the ship at the time. So let's move on to the starboard side, as little as we can see of it, because there really isn't much to see here. Most of the ship, aside from the extreme bow, is underwater. There's no notable damage visible on the bow either, and once you reach the bridge, there's nothing to see. The deck is completely submerged right up to the boat davits, and we don't have a close enough look to say much about the bridge, although we do see an open doorway on the number 1 turret right here. When you go further out in this image, not much changes. We can see how low the ship is at presumably high tide, but that's about it, which means we can now turn to pictures taken aboard the wreck. Starting here on the bow. This is a classic image of Aoba's wreck, where we have the two bow turrets and the bridge looming in the center. They are, of course, the most notable thing here. The number 1 turret still pointing straight amidships, and the number 2 turret trained to port, with the barrels elevated about as high as they'll go. You can also see someone inside that turret, which is easier to note in color. That and the various equipment scattered about, from rope to anchor chain, along with trees on the deck. It's not apparent if this is the remnant of camouflage or trees legitimately sprouting aboard the wreck. Those trees were removed in this image, which shows a couple other things of note. What look like hatches here. Those will show up again later, as will this bulge in the deck here. In fact, we'll see both of those things better in the next picture. The next picture is taken at deck level, looking forward. Here we can see 3 things of note. First, those trees, which do look like stuff growing on the ship more than camouflage. The second note, meanwhile, is front and center in the picture. A bulge in the deck, clearly caused by battle damage. It might be related to that hole in the side. And finally, we have a couple open hatches, here and here, along with what looks like a third opening way up at the bow. Unfortunately, this is the last look we get from deck level. The next 2 pictures are from the bridge. First, this one, looking over the bow. There's not much to note here that we haven't already seen. That opening on the bow is more apparent all the way at the front, as is another opening on the super-firing turret. The only other new things of note are the boats moored alongside, and the seeming lack of trees on the bow. Without much else to say, let's move on. The other bridge shot has more to note. This is looking aft from higher up on the bridge. This shows the anti-aircraft battery has been stripped off the ship. It also shows the seaplane platform and number 3 turret. This is the only image I've found that shows that area in detail, although there's still not much. The funnels and masts obscure most of the deck, and we can only see the barrels of the turret. Nonetheless, this is a fascinating look at Aoba's deck. It also brings us to the last 2 images, which return to wide-angle shots from the stern and the bow. Let's start with the stern. This one is mostly notable for showing how badly submerged the wreck is from this angle. Even the number 3 turret is mostly underwater, so this was probably taken at high tide. Almost the entire cruiser is underwater, aside from the superstructure and extreme forward end. Aoba is in shallow water, but the ship is also sunk, with all that implies. As for the last picture, well, that's a look from above. There's not much to say about the wreck itself. What this picture does show, however, is how close to shore she is. I think Aoba might be the closest of any of the wrecks. She looks even closer to shore than Issei or Haruna. It would not have been difficult to swim out to this wreck for the more adventurous type. I wouldn't be surprised if she was scrapped first for this reason, and for being a relatively easy scrapping compared to the bigger wrecks. Either way, that brings us to the end of the video. Aoba was a ship that refused to sink until, in the end, the damage finally caught up with her. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.